This last week, I was at a fringe meeting at the NEU conference, and one of the speakers was one of the students from the Pimlico school that had taken, that magnificent strike action against the racist head. And one of the points that she made really, really powerfully was that, they had to beg to be taught about the history of the British Empire, history of British colonialism, what had happened to, their peoples, what had happened to, in the countries where their families had come from. And I think this is a very common thing. It's something that's been a major feature of the Black Lives Matter movement in the last year. And that is equally true of the history of Ireland. Anyone familiar with the history of the British Empire, all those features, of the use of divide and rule, the arrogance of imperialism dressing up its mission as civilizing the backwoods savages, the British Empire's contempt for democracy, the reliance on violence and brutality to maintain their rule, the racism towards Irish immigrants, all of these features, all of these things are present in the history of Ireland too. And that's not just an historical thing that we're living with the legacy of. It's something that's present in the situation in Ireland today. The recent riots and disorder in the north of Ireland, mainly in loyalist areas, have brought the question of the Irish border back to prominence. There is the motivation for the riots is a sense of betrayal over border controls being imposed in the Irish Sea, rather than on the border between the north and the south of Ireland. And this is seen as a betrayal and a backsliding on the part of the Tory government. And it's been very cynically whipped up by the Democratic Unionist Party, the main unionist party in the north, who are unpopular because of that and for a whole load of reasons, and mired in corruption. And the way historically unionist parties built their bases by whipping up this sort of sectarian sectarian feeling. The delicate balancing act of the Good Friday Agreement 23 years ago is once again being pulled apart, and it's been unraveled, and it's very unlikely to return to stability anytime soon. And so what I want to do is briefly look at the history of partition in Ireland, how it came about and what it resulted in. Because this is very rarely discussed, especially in Britain. And I want to look at the reasons for that, challenge the standard view of Irish history, but I also want to then go on and look at what is needed and what sort of strategy is needed in order to achieve a united Ireland. Because the question of a united Ireland is also being discussed very, very much openly as a result of Brexit. Major official debates happening in the Irish Parliament and all that sort of stuff, but very, very on the most timid and cautious and conservative basis, which I don't believe will result in united Ireland without that route. So the standard narrative about Ireland and about the north of Ireland now is that there are two tribes: Catholic nationalists who want an independent Ireland that's independent from Britain, and Protestant unionists who want to maintain the north of Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. This was the standard narrative that underpins partition, to say that the people needed two separate states because they couldn't agree on what they wanted. And it also underpins the Good Friday Agreement. So the whole narrative of the Good Friday Agreement is to say that unionists and nationalists will never agree, and therefore they just have to come to some sort of arrangement where they can share power and have what they call, live with sort of parity of esteem for both tradition. But it's very important, I think, that socialists reject this view of Irish history and instead put the role of the British state at the heart of our understanding of Irish history. The partition of Ireland in 1921 was a mendacious and cynical move by the British ruling class to try to thwart the revolutionary movement for Irish independence, and also to head off the threat of working class revolt at a time when Europe and the whole British Empire was being swept by revolts and mutinies and uprisings. It resulted in a state in the north of Ireland that was built entirely on sectarianism and religious discrimination against the Catholic minority over issues like housing, jobs, everything, education, and so on. and also the dominant official ideology of the Unionist Party, which ruled the north of Ireland virtually uninterruptedly from 1921 to 1972, ruled with an official ideology that was also designed to attack and destroy class politics amongst Protestants. And that's what the nature of the Unionist politics actually is. So, yeah, as I say, the roots of all this are in the way in which British colonialism and British imperialism and the British state attempted to conquer Ireland. The first attempts at this date back to the 1100s, 1200s, and so on. The whole history of that time is this series of invasions by Britain and so on, attempts to have settlements, sort of wars against rebellions in Ireland and so on, and it's just a feature of that whole history. Oliver Cromwell, for example, after part of the whole motivation for the English Civil War is that the British king was constantly raising taxation in order to raise armies to go to Ireland to try and suppress rebellions. Cromwell's appeal to some of those people, the people who supported him, was to say that I will, if you back me in England, I will go and finally sort out the rebellions in Ireland so that they won't be costing you money. And that is indeed what he did after the English Civil War, went to massacres in Drogheda and Wexford and so on, the native Irish driven off their land and so on. So that is what we've seen. Ireland was constantly underdeveloped, seen as just a source of agricultural products for Britain, and ruled with an iron fist right through those years. Frederick Engels, for example, I just came across this quote a couple of weeks ago. Visited Ireland a number of times, and in the 1860s, not long after the Irish, the Great Hunger, what's usually referred to as the Irish Famine, just talked about like sort of how the country is completely ruled. In every nook and cranny, he said the government meddles in everything. There's not a trace of self-government. It's regarded Ireland, was the earliest English colony, and is still governed in exactly the same old way. One cannot fail to notice that the English citizens' so-called freedom is based on the oppression of the colonies. And in no other country have I seen so many gendarmes, and there were so many soldiers in Dublin that it looked like an occupied city. That was the way in which Ireland was ruled. The settlement of Ulster, a conscious attempt to settle mainly Protestant and Presbyterian people who've been cleared from Scottish Highlands and backed by the big guilds and the finance houses of the City of London, was another attempt to subdue and to secure Ireland for Britain, and that's the history of sort of Protestant settlement in the north and everything that came with that. This didn't always work out for Britain. And the history of Ireland, is important to see, is punctuated by revolts that took Britain by surprise and so on. None more so in 1798, when a united movement called the United Irishmen, led by Wolfe Tone and mainly led by Presbyterians in Belfast, and inspired by the French Revolution, came together and said that we are Catholics and Protestants and dissenters, all united. We want to drive Britain out. But their revolt was violently suppressed, and sort of the roots of the Orange Order in the north of Ireland and unionism really dates from that as this sort of reactionary, as a reactionary movement against the United Irishmen, and that saw the unity of Catholic and Protestant at the centre as a threat to British rule, and always tried to break that. For the century after that, the movement against British rule in Ireland was dominated really by two wings. It oscillated between movements that looked at constitutional changes, mainly around the question of home rule, the demand that Ireland would get its own parliament but remain within the British Empire and so on. This is led by the moderate nationalists, the Daniel O'Connells and so on. Ireland elected MPs to the British Parliament, and those MPs would go there, were mainly of a constitutional variety and appealing to the British government to allow some form of home rule. But when that constantly failed and stalled, this would then sort of people then would be drawn to insurrectionary movements that attempt to restart the rebellion of the United Irishmen, so the Fenian movement and so on, but again, often failed. What they both had in common, and this is significant, what they both had in common was that in general what they did was they postponed the solution of any of the social problems in Ireland until after independence. That is, they severed the connection between the question of Irish freedom and Irish independence and the solution of social problems. And this has become a major feature after right throughout British history. If you ever get a chance, I would really recommend that you read James Connolly's Labour in Irish History, a very short book, but it really goes through all this history and the implications of this for the various movements. All of this reached a real intensity in the first decades in the run-up to the First World War in 1914. The Liberal government in Britain was forced to rely on the Irish Parliamentary Party for votes, and in return they promised to bring a Home Rule Bill, and in return for that, the Tory party allied themselves with the most vicious reactionary backward unionists in the north, led by Edward Carson. They raised money for guns and so on, formed an illegal army called the Ulster Volunteer Force, threatened, sort of that if Home Rule went through, there would be a rebellion. British generals said that they wouldn't challenge the UVF and so on. And this is an incredibly intense period in Irish British history. In response to that, excuse me, the Irish Volunteers were also formed in the south of Ireland and so on. And in 1913, as a result of the Dublin lockout, a socialist volunteer force, the Irish Citizens Army, was formed by people like James Connolly and Sean Casey and so on, as a strike defence force. But that was the nature of Irish politics at that time. All of this was brought to an end by the start of the First World War. The outbreak of the First World War, the British government promised to the Irish Volunteers that they would give them Home Rule after the war if they backed them, and also promised to the Ulster Volunteer Force that they would stop Home Rule if the Ulster Volunteer Force backed Britain in the war. And what happened is that Irish Volunteers and the Ulster Volunteer Force all joined the British Army. 20,000 Irish people killed in the First World War, sort of as a result of this. Not everyone agreed with this, and this is where the 1916 Easter Rising came from. There was a split in the volunteers, and those who wanted to use the occasion of the war to once again have an insurrectionary movement and an uprising against British rule came together. Some of the Irish Volunteers, Padraig Pearse, these sorts of people, along with James Connolly's Irish Citizens Army. Connolly, and I don't have time to go into it, but allied himself with these people in order to try and strike a blow against the British Empire in the middle of the First World War and stage an uprising. The Easter Rising in 1916 was put down and suppressed. 20,000 British troops were brought into Dublin in order to suppress it. Massive destruction. The leaders were executed. And while it didn't have a great sense of popularity or support at the time it happened, when the leaders were executed, and above all, James Connolly, who William Martin Murphy, his great enemy, campaigned to have executed so that he'd be taken out of the movement in Ireland. When that happened, that created a great upsurge of radical feeling about independence and so on. Massive movement, strikes against conscription, and these sorts of things throughout 1917, 1918. And this resulted in a massive change when the election came after the war in 1918. From the Parliamentary Party being the main party in Ireland, John Redmond's party, Sinn Féin in that election won 75 seats out of 105 seats in Ireland. That was on the basis of a break with Britain, Irish independence now, not Home Rule, and so on. And it was the MPs who were elected for Sinn Féin refused to take their seats in the British Parliament and instead set up their own parliament in Dublin called the Dáil, and where they said we are going to start having running our own country now, no matter what Britain thinks. Britain, of course, refused to recognise this, and as a result, the War of Independence the Irish Republican Army started in 1919 in an attempt to make the country ungovernable for British rule. Significantly, what was happening in the north is that in 1919, together with Glasgow, Sheffield, Manchester, all those other sorts of places, there was a massive outbreak of working class revolt in the industrial centre of Belfast. Tens of thousands of shipyard workers, engineering workers were on strike, and a general strike in 1919, led by a united Catholic and Protestant movement that terrified the unionist bosses in the north. And this was the situation in which the negotiations that ended the War of Independence took place. And what the British government did was that they, behind the backs of the people negotiating in Ireland, came to a deal with Edward Carson and all the people who were backing him to partition Ireland, to take 6 counties out of the 9 counties of Ulster that were had a Protestant majority, and say we will set up a state and hand power to the unionist bosses. At the same time, they threatened massive violence against the Republican movement and Sinn Féin in the south of Ireland, and forced them into a treaty. And this was where the partition came about. What this resulted in was a society in the north, as I say, dominated by religious discrimination against the Catholic minority. Sort of the city that I grew up in, Derry, sort of overwhelming Catholic population, but gerrymandered and fixed so that the unionists would always control the city council and therefore control jobs, housing, and so on. And that was the
5 minutes left, Colin.
That was the situation pertained for 56, 60 years. A really militarized, militarized state, an armed militia, the B specials, and so on, that backed up the normal police force. And at every sign of challenge to their rule or any big strikes, this was used to drive a wedge with people. What's happening now, and the troubles, that sort of broke out, the attempts to fight for civil rights, that was then met with the utmost violence by both the Northern Ireland state and the British Army, gunning down people in places like Ballymurphy and Derry in 1972 and so on, resulted in an armed struggle and against them, and again, dominated that thing, which led to which entered an impasse. The armed struggle was never going to win in the north of Ireland, but the Good Friday Agreement that came out of it, came out of those delegate negotiations, was one that said we will put together a power sharing executive in which nationalist and unionist politicians will share power. But that was also always done, as was with partition, by a false, a series of lies by the British state to the nationalist parties, saying that if you stick with this and give up any violence, then eventually you will get a chance to have a vote for United Ireland. On the other hand, it said to the unionists, the union is now secure. We have now made sure that the borders are always going to be there. But it means that everything in the north of Ireland is locked into that sectarian framework of, is it good for Catholics or is it good for Protestants? Is it good for nationalists? Is it good for unionists? That applies to everything. If there's a hospital closing in the north of Ireland, the first question that's asked in Stormont is it in a Protestant area or is it in a Catholic area? All of these things are put in, are locked into this framework, which is why when you get a situation like Brexit unsettling this, again, what the response of people is not to say how could we have a better sort of society. It's to say our Protestant identity is being undermined and we must call the British government out for betrayal. What socialists say differently is that instead of separating off that question of Irish independence, as it always has been done by the Nationalist Party, from the social question, but what we need to really grasp is the thing that James Connolly attempted to do, was to say that you have to fight for a different sort of Ireland, north and south, not sort of just the north being merged into the south of Ireland, which itself is a very corrupt and rotten, backward regime as well, but that you had to fight for a different sort of society, and on that basis appeal to Protestant workers and Catholic workers to fight together to create that society. And you think about it, all those. I'll just try and finish on this. The massive pressing needs just re-emerge and come up all the time in Ireland. the pandemic has really exposed the rotten backwardness of the Irish health system in the south of Ireland, which is a privatized system. The Catholic Church and the reactionary politicians never allowed a national health service because they said women should be the ones that are the primary carers, and we don't need one. Now, comrades in Ireland, North and South, and People Before Profit and the Socialist Worker Network are arguing for an all-Ireland national health service. And those sorts of demands can begin to lay the basis for an appeal to say that we want a different sort of Ireland. And it's the same around social issues. The marvellous referendums over abortion rights and gay marriage in the south of Ireland indicate the direction in which people want to go. They're massive victory. The same struggle is taking place in the north of Ireland as well. And it's in that direction that we can look and see the hope for a united Ireland. But it has to be on the basis not of being dominated by the ruling classes in the south of Ireland or the north of Ireland or the ruling class in Britain, but has to come from below, and a movement that is fighting for a different sort of Ireland. And that means taking on the whole legacy of partition, openly challenging the sectarianism of the DUP, and also, crucially, always grasping the mendacity of the British state and the dishonesty of the British state, and realize that we're going to have to fight them to get there. And I'll leave it there.
That was fantastic, Colin. Thank you very much for that.